So, here's a story that happened fairly recently. It's the beginning of September. I'm soon going to be leaving on a semester-long trip away from home, still on that trip by the way, and I get a day to hang out with my best friend before I have to go. I go over to his place and we hang out. We talk for a while about what we're up to, and we eventually sit down to watch a show. He's a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and he gets me to watch the first 2 episodes of Rings of Power. In return, I finally get around to having him do something he's been planning on doing for a while now, watching the first part of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Skip to about a month later when I'm working on my Sonic 4 video, having finally reached a comfortable equilibrium between university work and being able to live like a human being. I figure that if I can get the Sonic 4 video out within the time span I want, I might be able to do a Halloween special. And considering my adoration of vampires, freaks of nature, and the aesthetically dark, I figured it'd be a crying shame not to do something for Hallows Eve. But what exactly should I do? Well, I figured JoJo would be a perfect fit. Now, I know for a fact that I have at least 7 JoJo fans in this community. I counted. But for the rest of you, the Sonic and Marvel people, you might be questioning my choices here. JoJo Mechanist Gamma? Isn't that the funny anime with the eccentric poses, punch ghosts, and gay people? You're not wrong, but the punch ghosts don't show up until the 3rd part. One of my personal favorite facets of JoJo is how each different part of the story functions in its own genre. They're all action shonen stories, but each is a different brand of it. Part 6, Stone Ocean, is a prison story. Part 5, Golden Wind, is a mafia story. Part 4, Diamond is Unbreakable, is a mystery story. Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, is a road trip story. Part 2, Battle Tendency, is, well, an Indiana Jones-like is the best way I can describe it. Part 1, however, is a perfect fit for the Halloween season. After all, Phantom Blood is a gothic horror story. Gothic fiction is characterized by an environment of fear, the threat of supernatural events, and the intrusion of the past upon the present. When the past actions of Dio Brando and Jonathan Joestar quite literally intrude on the present, as Dio Brando becomes the adopted brother of Jonathan Joestar, Dio proceeds to tear down every element in Jonathan's life. 7 years later, the man becomes the monster as Dio's rejection of humanity leads to inhuman horrors populating Britain, and Jonathan developing a supernatural martial art in order to stop him. It's certainly not your traditional gothic horror, but were Phantom Blood to be novelized, it would fit on the shelf right alongside Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The fact that Phantom Blood is so heavily gothic is incredibly important for the structure of its story, in particular, how it defines its moral core. This is what I wish to talk about today. Through its use of character arcs and development of the story, Phantom Blood makes a clear statement about morality that aligns with its gothic themes. So let's talk about that, shall we? Araki's first foray into the universe of his most popular franchise, a story about 2 brothers and the stone mask that brought horrors untold into the world. A story that is quite bizarre. Spoiler warning for the entirety of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Phantom Blood. Gothic fiction is a time-honored part of literature. Not only is this the place to find such classics as Dracula and Frankenstein, but also books like The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Slight tangent, but my fellow YouTuber TSD Talks has a video out talking about that book and the idea of fictional alter egos in general. I even helped out a little with it. Check it out, it's linked in the card above. There's also the fundamental text of The Castle of Otranto, as well as others like Vathek and Wuthering Heights. These are some classic examples of gothic horror, the link between them and other works establishing several core tenets of the genre. I would like to suggest that Phantom Blood, in fact, follows those gothic traditions to the letter, albeit in its own stylish manner. In Elements of a Gothic Novel, Robert Harris breaks down what he considers to be the core criteria of a Gothic novel. I'll be referring to this text as my sample piece on elements that Phantom Blood should reflect in order to qualify as a Gothic story. First, the setting of a classic castle. While the majority of the story takes place outdoors, one of the core set pieces in the part is Dio's castle placed at the end of Win Knight's Lot. Additionally, the first 3 episodes of the story revolve around the Joestar Manor, which, well, the mansion's also pretty relevant in terms of Gothic stories, I think. Second, the idea of mystery and suspense. Everything to do with the stone mask in this part is a mystery, as the first 2 episodes hammer in the idea of its strange and unorthodox elements. Even when the reveal of its capabilities is made, Dio's vampiric traits are unknown and simply compound questions on top of questions. As for suspense, it's JoJo. I don't think I need to explain this one, but almost 90% of Phantom Blood is made up of tension, both in direct conflict and not. Third, the idea of an ancient prophecy. While only occasionally brought up in the story, it's a recorded trend that members of the Joestar lineage die relatively young, with both George and Jonathan's deaths upholding that trend. Additionally, the stone mask itself is an ancient terror with stories behind it. While this is explored more in Part 2, Part 1 introduces a little of its origins while only giving just enough to have a rough idea of what's going on without having the full picture. Fourth, the idea of omens, portents, and visions. The most prominent example of this is Tonpetty's death of the future, as he tells Zeppeli to his face twice that Hamon training will lead to his death, a clear omen, one which the Baron ignores, and eventually foretells of the circumstances in which Zeppeli will die. Fifth, supernatural and supernatural and inexplicable events. A vampire takes over a town and turns a portion of the population into zombies, and he can only be stopped by his adopted brother using sunlight karate. Need I say more? Sixth, high overwrought emotion. This is something that JoJo is generally known for having. With Part 1 specifically, Jonathan, Dio, and Speedwagon all display very intense emotions in their time in the series, especially in reaction to hardship. Seventh, woman in distress. This applies to both Arena Pendleton and Poco's sister. The former, due to Dio assaulting her in her youth and later having her life put at risk by Dio's actions on the boat. The latter, due to being held captive in Dio's castle and turned over to a zombie to have his way with, which wouldn't have ended well if Jonathan hadn't shown up with that entire anvil when he did. Good for him, you gentleman, you. Woman being threatened by a powerful, impulsive, and tyrannical male is another point, but I'm including it here since it falls into the same general concern. Dio does not treat women with respect, and his literal inhumanity makes fighting back against him practically impossible. Eighth, the metonymy of gloom and horror. Ninth, the vocabulary of the Gothic. While more modern in comparison to the contemporary books I tie this back to, Phantom Blood regardless has a tendency to use old world vocabulary and goes on large rambles about semi-relevant information. It's the same type of stuff you'd see in Gothic novels, padding out the word count with information that arguably doesn't need to be there but enriches the story through its presence. This isn't one of the tenets that is outlined by Harris, but I think it's also worth note that the story takes place in the 1880s. This is the same general time period as several other notable Gothic horror books, most particularly Dracula and Frankenstein. So the time period also embraces the idea of it being a Gothic story. These 9 tenets, as outlined by Harris, make up what a Gothic story is. Compare the peril of Lucy Westenra and Mina Murray to that of Arena and Poco's sister, or the horrific depictions of Dracula's castle to the nightmares of Windknight's Lot. Compare the terror of Frankenstein's monster to the heartless brutality of Tarkus, or Victor's despair after losing his wife to Jonathan's rage at the death of his mentor. I hope I've proven my point well enough. Phantom Blood is a Gothic story told in the form of an eccentric shonen battle manga, and one that respects the medium it plays on. But what effect does that have on the characters? What point is being made through the use of the Gothic? I promise you an examination of morality after all. You shall have it, through the form of 2 tragic brothers. Oh, before we continue, we are shockingly close to 1,000 subscribers. I've got some cool content coming your way in the next few months, so it would be awesome if we could hit 1K before the end of the year. So make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more Mechanist Gamma. Jonathan Joestar, son of George Joestar, warrior of Hamon and the hero. Dio Brando, son of Dario Brando, demon of the stone mask and the villain. These 2 adopted brothers form the moral core of Part 1, serving as opposite ends of the spectrum and embodying the warring ideals and viewpoints that this story examines. Jonathan, for his part, is the ideal of what a true gentleman should be. Introduced as a young man with high aspirations to be a good man while dealing with his flaws, namely his anger and his reckless nature, Jonathan resembles a classic Gothic character, such as Jonathan Harker of Dracula fame. This is used to establish him as a good soul who's simply not ready for the events thrust upon him, namely, the way that the first 3 episodes establish his character. When we first meet Jonathan, he throws himself into a fight with bullies not to protect the girl they were harassing, but simply because it's the right thing to do. It establishes Jonathan's good heart and desire to do right, but it also establishes his limited worldview and naivety. After all, he doesn't understand why it's the right thing to do, just accepting that it is. This simplistic worldview isn't one that he loses, but rather one he gains context for. After all, Jonathan is a researcher at heart. Human nature is just one of the many facets he grows to understand. Then Jonathan suffers due to Dio's actions, again and again. He loses his social status, he loses his father's approval, his relationship with his crush is shattered, and he even loses his pet. Dio ruins his life, and then Jonathan simply has to live with him for several years. And then Jonathan loses more, with his research, father, and family home lost in the battle against Dio. And yet, the fires of hell reforge him stronger. Jonathan is forced to deal with trials beyond any normal man, and still comes out holding his belief in doing the right thing, now understanding what it truly means to fight evil. And that's only in the first third of the story. Jonathan's good heart and unending willpower serves to influence the world around him. Speedwagon is inspired to become his loyal companion. His father realizes his mistakes. Arena returns to him. Zeppeli chooses to take him on as a special protege. Bruford is redeemed in combat, and even Dio respects and is forgiven by Jonathan at the end of the journey. If there is inherent evil in mankind, Jonathan Joestar is living, breathing proof that it does not rule one's life. Simply by being himself, he can make everyone around him better and ward off the darkness with the light of his heart. Jonathan is an unshakably good man. In contrast, Dio Brando is quite literally evil incarnate. Marked with a trio of moles on his ear, the universe itself has deemed Dio to be a monster. While Dio lived his formative years as a gutter rat with an abusive father, that is not what specifically made him into a monster. As proved by Speedwagon, being born lower down the food chain doesn't inherently guide someone towards evil. However, those factors absolutely indulged his fall. Whereas Jonathan rises above the challenges placed before him and becomes stronger as a result, Dio is the opposite. He allowed himself to become jaded and selfish, putting himself above all others and rejecting everything good and human in himself for the sake of power. He is cold, malevolent, and relentlessly vile, the ice to JoJo's fire. And yet, despite every horrific action Dio takes in the series and everything he does to poor Jonathan, JoJo ends the story by embracing Dio in a hug and saying farewell to his brother. In the end, Jonathan forgave Dio, and Dio can clearly understand why. In the final episode, he has immense respect for Jonathan. Warped respect, but respect nonetheless. While Dio goes on to become a villain that would influence every single other part taking place in the original continuity, he is somehow able to be forgiven in that final moment by Jonathan. Even the manifestation of everything evil is not unforgivable. But there is a character placed in juxtaposition between the two brothers, Arena Pendleton. While her time in the series is short, what she does get is very impactful to this discussion. Arena is both a companion of Jonathan and a personal victim of Dio, having experienced the feud between both in an excessively personal manner. Jonathan gives her joy, and Dio steals it away. Jonathan gives her safety, Dio exposes her to true danger. Through the two men, Arena experiences both good and evil, stuck in a tag of war between the dueling natures of the world. And yet, in spite of all the trauma and horror she receives, she chooses not to abandon Jonathan. In returning to his side when he needs her most, Arena rejects Dio's nihilism and chooses to believe in the good of the world. But what if the others influenced by Jonathan? Let's talk about them. If we're going to talk about those influenced by Jonathan for the better, the most obvious example is the iconic, the loyal, the best girl himself, Robert E.O.'s Speedwagon. In a way, Speedwagon is used through the course of episodes 2 and 3 as a springboard to display the strength of Jonathan and Dio's respective characters. His assault in Ogre Street enforces the idea of Jonathan's unbreakable resolve, while also showing his good heart and willingness to forgive even those who just tried to murder him for some pocket change. Speedwagon's redemption is a speedrun, and it's one that is meant to serve as a template for how Jonathan will affect other characters in the future. Speedwagon is also decisive in situations where Jonathan is not, having no hesitation in shooting Dio in a critical moment where Jonathan couldn't bring himself to do so. Likewise, it is Speedwagon who reinforces Dio's display of character. Speedwagon is the one to point out that Dio is monstrous to the core, and is likewise the first to recognize that Dio has become inhuman. As the street-level observer who has no stakes in the conflict beyond protecting JoJo, Speedwagon is the one who is used to display the monstrous nature of the creature Dio has become. While his importance in the story wanes after episode 4 closes, he remains present as a friend for Jonathan and as a reminder that his beliefs about redemption and good men are not baseless. After all, Speedwagon is living proof of that. Let's talk about Tarkus and Bruford next. From the outset, they are depicted as being similar, knights devoted to a cause who hold a strong bond as battle brothers, both with an important link to the authority figure in their life. They are also depicted as titans among men who outclass all others, and yet, when their personalities are displayed individually, it's shown just how different they really are. For one thing, even zombified and unable to feel pain, Bruford requests for a one-on-one confrontation. He fights with honor and respect, even under the influence of Dio Brando. When Jonathan finally reaches the man's heart and frees him with Hamon, Bruford dies as a genuinely good man who leaves Jonathan behind a gift, the sword of luck and pluck, and is proven to be every inch of the man Jonathan believed he was. Bruford was redeemed by Jonathan. Tarkus, however, is an absolute monster. He smashes Bruford's remains under his boot and mocks his memory, and is fully willing to murder a child for interrupting his fight. This can't be chalked up to his zombification, as Tarkus boasts about having killed 48 people in the Chamber of the Two-Headed Dragon, meaning this evil was present in him long before the events of the story. Tarkus gets no redemption, no happy ending, not after killing Zeppeli. He is simply reduced to ash in a wave of fury. In this way, Bruford and Tarkus actually serve as mirrors to JoJo and Dio. Bruford aligns with Jonathan, his honor, his good heart, the chance to improve and pass on his hopes to others. Tarkus aligns with Dio. He is a heartless monster who relishes in bloodshed, with no hope for redemption due to his adamant refusal of any good part of himself. Tarkus and Bruford together are a microcosm of the themes of Gothic morality at play in the story. The rest of the characters in the story admittedly don't contribute much to this argument. Poco is a little pee-pee boy, Zeppeli is rock solid in his morality from his introduction, and the Hamon warriors, well, they don't really add much to part 1. However, before we close this section, there is one Hamon warrior in particular I want to talk about, Shueisha. This next section will contain spoilers for the beginning of part 2, so if you want to avoid that, you can skip straight to the conclusion. Shueisha is an interesting inversion of this idea of Gothic morality. When introduced to the story, he is the definitively good character, protecting innocent civilians from the zombies. After the story's events, he even takes in an adopted child and trains her in the ways of Hamon. But at the start of part 2, he chooses to become a vampire. Why? Because he was inspired by Dio. This may be a topic for a future video, but if Phantom Blood speaks to the inherent evil in people that can be amended by speaking to the good, Battle Tendency has a lot to say about the opposite, good people being influenced by evil and falling to their vices. Shueisha is the perfect example of this, as his fall serves as the inverse of what we've talked about with Speedwagon and Bruford. Some fun food for thought. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Part 1, Phantom Blood. In the words of Araki himself, a story about being alive and an affirmation that humanity is wonderful. It is a story that leans heavily into Gothic themes and plays with narrative devices found first and foremost within tales of that genre, using the darker perspective on the world to expand on the supernatural elements and establish a unique view of morality. Everyone inherently possesses evil within them. With the right light, however, that evil can be quenched and goodness can flourish within every single person. Phantom Blood is tragic, heartbreaking, and bittersweet. And yet, it is a hopeful message that can speak to anyone. Those down in the dumps, consumed with anger and paranoia, can always strive to be better. Find an example, hold on to that example tightly, and strive to never stop becoming a better person than you were before. It's a lesson that I've tried to keep in mind in my own life. And isn't that why we look up to those we consider to be better men than ourselves? In Mr. Hyde Doesn't Exist, the new TST Talks video I referenced earlier, he ends with a terrifying thesis statement, that the capacity for a Mr. Hyde exists within us all, that unkempt, unruly evil that could lie buried within the heart of any one of us. And yet, that does not make humanity irredeemable. There is always evil, but there is always the capacity for good as well. Fight off the dark thoughts, form rigid bonds to hold yourself accountable, and never lose the spark of goodwill that burns within you. That is the legacy JoJo has left us. This relentless, unending, and soulful Phantom Blood. Special thanks to my friend Grant for helping me plan out this video, as his insight into Jonathan and Dio's characters was a major part of this turning out the way it did. Likewise, thanks to Halliday for the thumbnail art. She has commissions open still, so go get some cool art from her and tell her Gamma sent you. I'm Mechanist Gamma, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye, JoJo!
Why did you save me?